The world needs more innovations for a sustainable future. Silicon Valley is a world-leading ecosystem of actors working together to identify opportunities and scale innovations in a global market. The close interaction with leading universities and the strong presence of venture capital contribute to creating a dynamic innovation system. Vinnova Silicon Valley's mission is to highlight Sweden as one of the most innovative regions in the world and link the Swedish innovation system and Silicon Valley. Together with the other Nordic countries, Vinnova has created the Nordic Innovation House, which connects tech companies and research institutions from the Nordics with the Silicon Valley ecosystem. Vinnova also offers fellowships in Silicon Valley in collaboration with Wallenberg Foundation. Vinnova. We need to innovate how we innovate.
Welcome to Vinnova Silicon Valley and Sweden Innovation Day, broadcasted in collaboration with Nordic Innovation House. Vinnova Silicon Valley edition focuses on sustainable themes by 7 sessions in 3 days. Check the program for all our sessions. These sessions will be recorded and you will find it on swedensiliconvalley.se in a short while. Again, welcome and enjoy.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everyone, wherever you are in the world. My name is Joakim Skog. I'm the strategic lead for Futures area at Vinnova, Sweden's innovation agency. And I'm so happy to welcome you all and also to introduce Leah Zaidi from Institute for the Future. I'll get back to you in just a while. Before moving on, a few practicalities. As you heard, this webinar will be recorded. After a short intro from me and Leah's presentation, we'll have a Q&A, or before that, we'll have an interview with Felicia Gustafsson, my colleague at Vinnova, and then we'll have a Q&A session before ending this first event of the evening after 49 minutes. So keep those questions coming in the chat, because I will pick out the questions for the Q&A part from the chat. So do keep them coming there and I'll pick them up after one after another. So we at Vinnova, we recognize that innovation is more important than ever. We know that the challenges we face in today's society are both complex, global, requires new ways of thinking. We need to update our toolbox. We've been using tools which we now see that they do not really cut it when it comes to these problems we have. And the team working in Futures area at Vinnova, we're searching for new themes for Vinnova or Sweden to address, but also systematizing how we lead from the future. And this leading from the future is really important to us. It's about accelerate the transformation needed. And leading from the future, another way of talking about leading from the future, that is working with strategic design, right? And why do we need strategic design? Why do we need to create scenarios of plausible futures? Well, we need to find new paths to that desirable future. We need to find those paths, and in order to do that, we begin with imagining the desirable future. We create scenarios, we stir up emotions, even provoke them. So that's what we're all about, and we're really excited of exploring this. We're just getting started, but as it happens, on Monday, 24th of January, we're opening our first public open call with a clear foresight perspective. So what we're doing, we're asking organizations to work with us and create physical artifacts visiting us from the future. In other words, we're working with speculative design. And we're really excited about this. This is a preview of what will be published on Monday. But why are we doing this? Because we want to make sure that we create the future together. The future is nothing that just happens to us. We create the future together. And by working with speculative design, by working with strategic foresight and physical artifacts from the future, we think that we're exactly what we're doing. So let me see just end my presentation mode here. Sorry about that. Or did I unshare the screen, right? Yes, good. So without much further ado, I'd like to introduce Leah Zaidi, and you're the research director at Institute for the Future, where you focus on strategic world building and systems innovation. You're also an international advisor to the Citra Fund, which, by the way, we had as guests yesterday at a webinar. I hope that we could post a rerun of that webinar as well, because hearing Mikko Duva from Citra talking about weak signals was also intriguing. But back to you, Leah. You're associate editor of the World Futures Review, and today you're going to let us in on futures thinking for building climate positive organizations. So Leah, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you very much. Very excited to hear that you got to share some knowledge with Citra Fund and hear from Mikko, who's really wonderful. So today I'm going to actually talk to you about building climate positive organizations, and give me just a second to set this up. So I want to start this conversation by talking about what happened in Vancouver, which is relatively close to where I live in Toronto. It's the same country. But what happened was that Vancouver made headlines twice. First time for wildfires over the summer, and then the second time in December for flooding. And I wanted to share this particular example because this is a pattern that's playing out across the world. But part of the reason why BC and Vancouver made headlines is because we don't think of the West as being as deeply affected by climate change as other parts of the world. And really, these examples showed us that we're not immune to the problems. What happened in Vancouver, especially with the flooding, triggered off a cascading effect. So, there was disruption to supply chains. There were, catastrophic losses to livestock. One of the things that happened is that the floods triggered a landslide that wiped out the main artery, the road that connects BC and Vancouver to the rest of the country. And so this is what we can potentially anticipate in the years to come as this pattern plays out all over the world. And this particular quote from our IFTF Vantage research on climate positive organizations really stuck out to me. It's from Christina Dahl, and she asked, how many times can we say unprecedented? This is a word that we're using a lot lately, and it's a word that we're probably going to continue to hear over the years to come, particularly if we don't take enough action now in the present day. And of course, with unprecedented events comes a sense of uncertainty. So strategic foresight is really about the tools, the processes, and the mindsets that we need for making decisions under conditions of uncertainty. So we explore multiple alternative futures in order to understand what to do today. And that, of course, includes some of the more transformative futures. And our stance is really that, we can't predict the future. We don't really know for certain what's going to happen. But what we can do is we can explore the possibilities. And by doing that, we consider the future as not something that's already decided, but something to be revealed bit by bit, rather than something, something to be created. So we have active agency in this future and how we go about shaping the world that's yet to come. And so in this presentation, we're going to focus on two aspects of foresight. So signals, which you've already heard about from Mikko, but signals are concrete, compelling observations about how the world is changing. And it can be small or local innovations with the potential to scale. And then we're going to look a little bit more at forecasts. So forecasts are stories about the future that provoke insights about the present. They're plausible, they're provocative, and they're informed by evidence. So this is what we're going to focus on for the rest of the presentation. And so we're at a point now where responding to climate change is really critical. This isn't a new challenge. We've known about this for decades, and we're really seeing how, this distant, far off idea of climate change, something that we thought about as being abstract and a little bit, futuristic, is really becoming a present day reality. We're living it now in a way that we hadn't in previous decades. And the public demand for action is growing, particularly as we see the Earth deteriorating. And we see new demands being made by younger generations. And in this context that's emerging, business as usual won't work anymore. We really have to come together as a collective and not as competitors that are out for our own intents. And so in an era of unprecedented climate change and climate catastrophes, we'll need climate positive organizations that really rise up to meet the challenge of what's coming next. And so a climate positive organization works aggressively to cut carbon emissions to zero, not just to reduce them, but to get them to zero as quickly as possible. And it works to improve the health and the resiliency of the environmental systems around us by removing more carbon than it produces. So if we can actually undo some of the damage that we've done. And so we think that climate positive organizations through our IFTF research has yielded about 5 principles that we think we should be adhering to as we go forward. And that includes distributing responsibility for climate change, pursuing positive sum strategies, addressing systemic injustices, employing polymorphic strategies, and of course, adopting a stewardship mindset. So we're going to go through each of these in turn. I'm going to introduce you to a signal for each one, and then we'll get to forecast once we're done all the principles. So the first principle, which is about distributing responsibility, is really a shift from CSR to organizational strategy, coming to the core of it. So rather than treating climate positive initiatives as something that a section of the organization does, it needs to be distributed throughout the organization. So even departments like HR, marketing, accounting need to take this into factor when we're shifting the organization towards a climate positive mindset. And so organizational leaders need to think about building a sense of psychological standing. So that is having ownership and responsibility in the problem. Everyone's seeing mitigating climate change as a fundamental part of their role. So regardless of what your role is in the organization, it's factored in, and a shift in mindset around responsibilities and the new ways to measure success. So what gets measured gets done. And so we need to think about those new emerging metrics. And we skipped over the signal. So a signal for emerging change that's coming up that relates to this particular principle is Apple and Chipotle recently announced plans for executive bonus formulas for hitting ESG goals and targets. And so the implications of that is that it incentivizes executive leaders to meet responsibility metrics and climate targets. There's a shift that will encourage leaders to focus on long-term organizational management and reinforce climate positivity as a core goal of the organization rather than a nice-to-have opt-in. And so principle number 2 is pursuing positive sum strategies. So here we're going from competition to collaboration. Climate crisis will destabilize entire categories of activities rather than individual entities. So we have to think about the system as a whole. We have pooling efforts and sharing of resources. So rather than, this is ours and this is yours, we're actually coming together as an ecosystem to address the challenges. And it's pre-competitive collaboration to create positive rather than negative externalities. So again, we're thinking as a whole about how do we create positive outcomes and potentially compounding benefits to some of the solutions that we're implementing as well. And so a nice signal that we're seeing emerge around this is the Sustainable Vanilla Initiative, which brings about 28 large purchasers, and they're looking for better ways to invest in wages and long-term sustainability of their supply chain. And so, of course, this is greater protection against climate risks and stronger supply chains that we're going to see. And so initiatives like this are really important because you have traditional competitors coming together in a pre-collaborative sense to really think about how they're going to think long-term about securing their place in the future. And principle number 3 is addressing these systemic injustices. So we often think of climate change as a separate problem from other complex challenges that we're facing, but really they're tied closely together. And so we're going to see a shift from organizational challenges, addressing those, to addressing systemic challenges. And so structural racism and inequality places some communities at higher risk than others. So we need to take into account how there is disproportionate impact. And that disproportionate impact, of course, has a greater effect on impoverished communities, people of color, and it does exacerbate existing disparities. So really, we're going to see conditions under which climate change makes current challenges that we're facing even worse. And then there's an opportunity to adopt strategies that mitigate both the climate crisis while adapting, while also addressing systemic inequality. So a good example of this is planting trees. It doesn't seem like a big surprise that trees are important to the fight against climate change, but what we're also seeing is that trees have a positive impact on mental health, but also do things like reduce violence. And so thinking about how one solution could potentially impact other areas and improve other things as well is going to be important. And so here we go. We see reforestation as a signal. Tazo Tea and American forests work together to increase urban planting with BIPOC communities. And of course, the implications of this is improved communities placed at greater risk due to climate crisis. And then we create jobs as well. So solutions like these having compounding benefits is really important. And the fourth principle is employing polymorphic strategies. So we're going from targeted strategies, again, that impact one thing, to polymorphic strategies, which is a little bit more shape-shifting. So no matter how rapidly we decarbonize, we're still going to be facing crisis multipliers, which is something that's coming from NATO's Secretary General. So this idea that one crisis is going to trigger another and another and another, and we're going to see those cascading effects. This dynamic will favor organizations that adopt flexible strategies to meet the demands of external change. It will also punish organizations that pursue single path towards efficiency. So some flexibility and some shape shifting is going to be required in terms of how we pursue strategies and how we respond to change that we're facing, especially climate change. And so a signal that we're seeing emerge around this is nanofactories. So Unilever is developing a nanofactory that's designed to fit inside a shipping container, and that can be adapted and moved around easily. So we have small batch production, more like just in time rather than mass production, mobile factories that can go from one location to another, adaptive product lines that meet shifting conditions, and rapid prototyping. And of course, this is an example, a good example of polymorphic strategies. And so the fifth principle is adopting a stewardship mindset. So we're going to go from thinking about just the next quarter, what's coming up very, very shortly. We get trapped in this mindset of, profitability and how we're going to meet the goals of the next quarter. And that shift is going to happen towards expansive time horizons. So rather than thinking about, just the short-term profitability, we need to go towards a stewardship mindset that's critical in balancing flexibility within the short run with long-term horizon planning. And so leadership in this context has to be reimagined. We're responsible not just for the present day, but thinking about future stakeholders as well. Who are we affecting by our actions in 20, 30, even 100 years? Thinking in those long-term time horizons and taking future stakeholders into account shifts what leadership becomes in that sense. And then rebalancing and understanding of profit and loss, as well as understanding which costs are truly external. So right now, a lot of organizations might think of climate change related costs as something external to them, not something that's built into their bottom line necessarily. But when you think about the fact that your factories might be affected by erratic weather and extreme weather, the fact that people may not be able to come into work or be able to connect through remote opportunities as well. If, for instance, power goes out, these things have to be factored in as part of the day-to-day business reality going forward, especially if we're not taking enough action in the present. And so a signal that we're seeing come up around this is the fiduciary responsibility around climate change and environmental stewardship. So Rebecca Henderson at the Harvard Business School, who wrote Reimagining Capitalism, notes that about 2/3 of assets under management in the US are invested in funds that have some exposure to risk. So there's planetary risk involved in where our money is tied up. So Vanguard also notes that the index funds have an indefinite horizon. So index funds are not, time oriented in the sense that we're really only thinking about the next 3 months or the next few years. Their index funds have an indefinite horizon. So taking planetary risk into account is going to be critical going forward. The financial world is, in a sense, very tied to environmental stewardship. There is really no separating them. And so the implications of this is that there's probably going to be more top-down pressures coming that will likely intensify as climate crisis worsens. And we're probably going to see new demands on organizations to rethink their boundaries. So rather than, thinking about the immediate ecosystem that they're operating in, their operational environment, going beyond that to think about the broader environment in general. So taking other stakeholders into account, taking nature into account, and thinking about how all of these things are interconnected and the implications that it has for us. And stewardship models, of course, need to incorporate environmental factors as well as social factors. Okay, so now we're going to get to some of the fun bits. So our IFTF Vantage research has a ton of signals, more than what you just saw here, but it also has a ton of forecasts associated with some of these emerging forces that we're seeing. And so I'm just going to introduce you to 3 forecasts. So forecasts are, again, not predictions about the future. We're not saying that this is necessarily going to happen, but they're plausibilities and provocations that we want you to think about. And so as we go forward, one of the things that we might see is the environment of things, a network built around living things for constant measurement and constant adaptation. So as we mentioned earlier, measuring things is going to be really critical as we think about climate positivity. And of course, what gets measured gets done. So over the next decade, many organizations will need to pay close attention to the details of carbon emissions, energy use, and impacts of climate disruption. The deployment of environmental monitors may be driven by regulation, insurance, or basic self-interest. Much of the data gathering and analysis will be done in-house, but some will be handled by a variety of emerging environmental data services. So we might see new services, new organizations, new government entities that help with measurement. All of this will rely upon increasingly sophisticated and diverse collection of sensors. Moreover, as the need for real-time data grows and moves into the consumer space, we'll see a growing need to weave sensing and data collection technologies into our physical space and materials. So the Internet of Things might soon be reconceived as the environment of things. And so we'll see the shift of, deploying AI, IoT solutions towards environmental challenges. That shift is already starting to happen. And so as we see more and more of these sensors, they could be built directly into organizational success metrics. And some of that might come as you taking initiative to participate in these technologies and take advantage of them. But some of it, again, might be top down and come from regulation. And so you may have no choice but to report out. And the more these things are open to the public and the more they're reported, it's possible that it could potentially impact how you do business, but also how you're perceived as an organizational leader in your ecosystem. The second forecast that we've written relates to the rise of steward ownership, so owning and operating businesses that benefit future stakeholders. And so we might see here cooperatives, mutual organizations for benefit corporations, employee-owned companies, and other corporate structures offering alternatives to the common shareholder model of governance. Over the coming decades, climate-positive organizations will move away from ownership models towards stewardship approaches, relying on tools such as perpetual purpose trusts, in which beneficiaries of the trust are the purpose of the business. Putting an organization's purpose on par or even above profits, steward-owned organizations can allocate funds to support future stakeholders, manage proceeds from acquisition or exit strategies, and direct profits back to local communities or social causes. A transition towards more steward ownership will lead to more climate positive organizations because it will relieve business leaders from short-term demands of shareholders and financial markets. And this will de-emphasize measurements such as quarterly profits and will emphasize longer-term orientation to account for the present and future health of people and the planet. So if we're thinking about steward ownership as being broader. So what does it mean for instance, to have an organization in which nature has a direct ownership stake in the organization, for community members in which you operate to also have that ownership stake, people who are affected by the day-to-day operations of your business, for employees to potentially have ownership stake within companies in a more comprehensive way. So these are all factors to think about, and what does it mean for this construct to emerge? And so some organizations are already set up where they have profit sharing with employees and part ownership, but what does it mean for all organizations to shift in this direction? And the final forecast I'm going to share is around embedded climate governance. So this is the emergence of automated enforcement. So sensors and some surveillance technology embedded in buildings, spaces, environments, and personal items will create a robust information system. So this information will allow governments and organizations to adjust, adapt, and control systems that affect climate to a greater degree than ever before. And it will provide carbon markets with essential data and verification that transactions are having the intended impact that they're supposed to. And as environmental data becomes increasingly tracked and standardized, it will be combined with automated tools for embedded legal enforcement into local sites. Environmental sensors arrays will monitor activity similar to cameras embedded in red lights that detect violations and trigger automated enforcement mechanisms. So this is really the other side of the environment of things that we looked at earlier. So the idea of embedded governance within organizations and how that is tracked. So we're looking at the monitoring of certain metrics, how you're contributing potentially to climate positivity or potentially detracting from it, and then looking at the implications in terms of what the response will be to violations and how automated enforcement mechanisms could come into play. So is it possible to have things like an AI algorithm that once an infraction is made, that algorithm kicks in and decides it's going to start siphoning off a percentage of your profit towards offsetting the damage that you potentially have done to the environment. And so those sort of mechanisms are constructs that we can play around with in terms of thinking about what's plausible and what's possible in the future. Again, we're not saying that any of these things are necessarily going to happen, but they're provocations that we want to play with in terms of thinking about where things could potentially go. And we are close to wrapping up. So the climate crisis will demand that organizations set ambitious long-term goals and begin acting on those goals today. So we're going to see a lot of shifts in terms of what comes up. Again, things like consumer demands, regulations might shift in the future. And so the demands placed on organizations are likely going to shift with them. And ultimately, what we need to think about is that there is really no profit without planet and people. So, one of the things that I noticed before that has kind of shifted, and I'm glad to see the shift, is that we were talking about the future of work in the context of just AI and automation. What does it mean to, bring in robots and have them displace people? What we weren't talking about is the impact of things like climate change and climate migration and how that will impact the future of work. Almost like we were talking about the future of work in the context of it happening on a different planet without taking the scientific data into account. So this idea that climate change is something that affects all of us, that nobody is immune, that businesses across the board are going to be affected. It is going to be the new operating environment for all of us, is something that we really have to pay attention to. There's no way to really move beyond a state of complete crisis and catastrophe without it affecting all of us and all of us having some sort of part in it. So really, we have to get to a place where we're thinking about planet and people first. So thank you very much for listening to this presentation. I do want to remind you that this is just a very small fraction of the work that my colleagues have done on this topic. We have a set of future visions of climate positive organizations. We are also helping organizations build a blueprint for action, identifying what their climate positive archetype is and the role that they can play towards shifting their organization towards that state. So if you want to look up more on this material, you can always visit Vantage at vantage.iftf.org. You can email me and I can put you in touch with the right people to further the conversation about how you can become a climate positive organization as well. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Leah. Super interesting, and I can't wait to get to the Q&A section. I tried not to go in too much into the methodology behind that, but talk more about the organizational point of view. But before entering the Q&A session, and those of you that you've been listening to Leah now, please put your questions in the chat and I'll pick them from there. But before, I'll talk a little bit with you, Felicia Gustafsson, my colleague at Vinnova. Just shortly, introduce yourself. What do you do at Vinnova?
Yeah, so just short, I work with different tasks at Vinnova, but one part is that I'm part of the sustainability team, where we work with climate and Agenda 2030 and gender equality.
Great, thanks. And so, listening to Leah and thinking about what we do at Vinnova, what's your take on why it's important that organizations work with foresight and climate?
Yeah, I think I think it was a great presentation, Leah. Thank you so much. I just want to also highlight, I mean, we need to reduce our global CO2 emission by almost 8% a year until 2030 to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming. And I think to put that in context, we reduced our global CO2 emission by 6.4% during the COVID pandemic. So it's a huge transition that we will need to make. We will radically need to transform most sectors of society, as we also talked a lot about during the different sessions here at Sweden Innovation Days. And when you think about that way, I think it becomes extremely clear that organizations need to consider both how they will be impacted, but also how they can maximize their own contribution to a net zero transition. And I think climate change will and is already driving a lot of innovation and also new business opportunities. So just not to mitigate risk, but also to kind of reap the benefits of this transition, because otherwise I think you will lose out on a lot of opportunity as well as an organization.
Indeed. And how do you see Vinnova's role in this as a governmental agency?
Yeah, our role is to promote and foster research and innovation that helps us address societal challenges. And climate change is, of course, one of the most critical challenges we are facing today. So we do that through a number of different strategies. So we, for example, stimulate and create space for cross-sector collaboration, because I think that also Leah highlighted this very well in her presentation, that we need these solutions that are larger than one actor alone in order to actually solve complex challenges, and this is a highly complex challenge. And also we identify areas where we need to stimulate change to achieve a sustainable transition. And you can say that we pinpoint challenges where innovation is needed. And then of course we also a lot about organization is also about providing funding for initiatives so that other actors can explore, they can develop, and they can test new ideas before they are profitable. So to come back to your question about how we enable climate positive organizations, you could say that we mobilize actors that have an impact or are impacted by climate change. We identify areas where Vinnova can help accelerate a net zero transition. And we also, of course, fund initiatives that explore these early stage ideas and demonstrate solutions.
So do you have any examples how this is done in practice?
Yeah, I think a really good example is the initiative you mentioned in the beginning on foresight, but we also have a few funding opportunities coming up now in 2022, which I think is really interesting for organizations working and kind of trying to act on this opportunity to become climate positive. And the first one is a circular economy. We know that is vital to our decarbonization effort. We will have a call this spring for projects that develop resource efficient and circular solutions in industry. We also have another call opening now in February, which is targeting actors in civil society and organizations that would like to collaborate with civil society. And here we look for projects that aim to test solutions to reduce carbon emissions or improve resilience in industry, mobility, food production and consumption, and built environment. So it's a pretty wide scope and really an opportunity for actors to get the opportunity to work on these challenges before solutions are profitable. And then, of course, we also have, also want to highlight another example where we work more internationally with mobilizing actors, because we know that we don't only need collaborations between sectors nationally, but we also need to work on a global level. And there we have the Sweden-US Green Transition Initiative that will kick off this spring. And this is a collaboration between Vinnova, the Swedish Energy Agency, and also Business Sweden. And in short, it aims to accelerate collaboration within research and innovation related to the net zero transition. And I think if that sounds interesting, I would really recommend following Sweden in Silicon Valley on LinkedIn for updates and also future activities related to that.
Great, thanks. Wonderful. So let's dive into the Q&A session then. Well, before that, I really like the quote there that you had, Leah. There's no profit without the planet or people. And I heard yesterday, or a quote from our Director General, Daria Isaksson. She also says that the planet has set the deadline that we just can't miss. It's non-negotiable. So, and on that note, I'm thinking when it comes to scenarios and creating them, there's always this balance between the dystopian view and the utopian view. Some people are driven by hope, and others really need that sense of urgency. What are your thoughts on that? Which way should we go? Do we need to, because I mean, creating a sense of urgency regarding the climate crisis is also could make, like, it's a problem from a mental health perspective, for instance. So what are your thoughts?
Sure. So when we create scenarios, we try to avoid just the good and the bad. That dichotomy is very easy to get caught up in, right? So either going to the extreme negative or the extreme positives. And so every time we create scenarios, we try to create them with nuance. So acknowledging that in every single scenario, there are winners and losers. So even in the worst collapse scenario, there are likely winners. There's likely somebody who's potentially benefiting relatively to others, so not necessarily benefiting and thriving the way we are now. It's sort of benefiting relatively to the conditions that are present. And same thing in transformation. Transformation isn't always transformation for everybody. It can leave some people behind. So when we think about in terms of organizations, in a collapse or a transformation, there may be new organizations that have to emerge, and there may be old organizations or incumbent organizations that have to disappear in order for that future to be possible, or to just allow the circumstances to play out. So that's one side of things. When we think about the binary, it's really important to just break out of that. This is going to be all bad and all good. We have to get down to that level of what is the evidence saying. So as we build scenarios, what we're finding increasingly is that we're building scenarios taking into account the climate data that we're seeing. And so when we build the best case scenario, it's not everything is perfect and the earth is flourishing and we fixed all the problems. It's we've achieved 1.5 degrees, and 1.5 degrees warming is not great. It's not we talk about it as if it's the best case scenario, but really it brings a lot of negative things with it. It brings things like potentially mass poverty, a lot of loss, and a lot of negative externalities. So we're finding increasingly we have to take that into account as we build in even the most positive scenarios. Because if you can't describe the pathway there, so if we can't describe the pathway to a transformative future without, a magical technology coming into play, it's not really plausible and it's not evidence-based.
Interesting. I recall yesterday, Mika Duva, we talked about who is he worried about? We were talking about young people and how do we get them to understand this and how do you nudge them in the right direction? And he said, I'm not worried about the young generations. I'm worried about our generation, because we're not talking about the right things. We're not admitting to ourselves that the changes needed and also the future, the new normal, that's it's so safe to say that we're entering after the pandemic. There's a new normal, and regarding the climate crisis, whenever we get through that, as you say, 1.5 degrees is not a great thing. The new normal is not a safe place. It's not a great place to be. So yes, reflecting on that we're the ones that really need to wake up and understand it doesn't have to be dystopian, but still we need to admit that the changes needed are way bigger than we can imagine right now. And I mean, working with scenarios and get people engaged in scenarios, I see that as a really powerful way of one by one getting people on board and like empowering people to do something. One thing when it comes to empowering, we were talking about, so organizations, now I don't really know who's listening to this discussion right now, but if you're in an organization that hasn't been working with scenarios, looking at your 3 examples, what do you do next? What's the next step to dive into this?
Sure. So there's 2 ways of going about it. The first is the easiest, but will cost you a little bit of money, which is to go find a foresight expert. And that is, you can hire internally to get somebody who's on staff, or you can start by working with an organization that is already doing foresight work. And there are many of those, including IFTF. So it is about getting a handle on the expertise, but acknowledging that this is a different expertise that a lot of organizations don't have. And so the first step is to actually go and acquire the expertise from somewhere, from experts who know what they're doing. And the second is, all foresight work has signal seeking built into it. So you can't really do foresight work unless you do signals. There's lots of difference in methodology. Different people approach foresight work in different ways. Different organizations have different processes, but every single organization and every single person doing foresight work should be looking at the signals. And so you can start immediately by doing a quick scan, looking for those emerging pieces of evidence that are coming up that are a little bit of a blip in the horizon, right? So it's like this one thing, this one organization is doing something a little different. This one person has an interesting story that they're telling. This one city is doing something that's a little unique, and start gathering those and thinking about what are the implications of that? What does that mean for your organization if that signal, for instance, were to become the dominant reality? So that's usually how we start off doing that work. That's usually step 1. And then combining those with the larger forces that are at play. So what does it mean to think about, the generational shifts that are happening? So for millennials and Gen Z and even Gen Alpha to start coming into positions of power and decision making, how might that change things? So we combine those signals with those forces and start to look at implications. And that's step 1 of the full process.
So we got a question from Jonas Botani Werner. Could you please elaborate a bit more on the concept of polymorphic strategies? And he's also wondering if that is, we'll see, if it's somehow related to Vinnova. We've been working with mission-oriented innovation. But if you expand a bit on polymorphic strategies.
Sure. So polymorphic strategies are strategies that are a bit shape-shifting and adaptable in their nature. So you're looking for things that are effective in multiple scenarios. So when we do scenario work, we imagine the alternatives that might arise in the future. So 10, 20 years out, we might look at how the world might be different. And then polymorphic strategies might be strategies that are effective in multiple scenarios. So if the world, achieves a transformation state, and let's say we keep climate change to 1.5 degrees, what's a strategy that's good and effective there? If the world reaches a collapse state and we experience the absolute worst of environmental deterioration, is that same strategy potentially going to hold up in that scenario as well? So concepts like the nanofactory that we saw, that's a good strategy because regardless of the scenario that emerges, whether it's positive, negative, nuanced, in between, that strategy presents a lot of benefits. So having mobility could not only be a good solution to have when you're experiencing extreme and erratic weather, it could be a good solution to have when demand shifts from one market to another and you need to go meet that demand. Or, if consumer demands shift to having a lot of hyper-personalization and customization. Microfactories, nanofactories are better at responding to those things than they would be if you're mass producing product, for instance. So having those strategies that are flexible in that sense, that can perform well under different conditions, is essentially what you want to be looking for.
Another question here, and this might also be something for Felicia. What are your reflections on how public sector will need to adjust in order to adapt to new realities?
Do you want me to start, Joakim? I think maybe you have some reflections from a foresight perspective. I think we also have to consider, like as Leah was saying, how we will be impacted by the different scenarios that might play out with climate change, and also work actively with foresight. I think that's a really good example. And I also think especially we need to consider how we can maximize our own contribution to the net zero transition. Like, how can we make the most impact? And I think also need to collaborate in new ways with other actors in the system to actually enable them to do that. So I think we really need to consider how we can accelerate and do better than what we do today, but also then build foresight into our own operations.
Yeah, on that note, we're looking at creating a network, foresight network in Sweden nationally, inspired by Finland once again, but they're really ahead in this. So it's a good country to follow. Tatiana, you're asking Leah, do you have a concrete story to tell when you managed to create an aha moment for a management group or our organization with the help of future scenarios?
Yeah, so I can't give out particular names of organizations. We do tend to be under strict NDAs on that front. But usually, one of the assumptions that organizations tend to make is that because they exist in the present day, they're going to continue existing in the future. And so part of what comes out of scenario work is demonstrating that there are circumstances that are plausible, that are likely, in which the organization no longer exists. And so when we create the scenarios, the next step after creating the scenarios is getting you to step into them and thinking about, what does that mean? What is the implication of that scenario for you as an individual or as an organization or as an ecosystem? What are the ramifications of that? And sometimes that means getting people to see that things are going to be worse than they actually are, and that as an organization, you may not have a place in that future. You're taking a big assumption there when you assume that you're going to have a place in that future. And so that typically creates one of those moments of like, oh, if we don't do things differently, we're actually eroding our future existence by not taking action in the present. And that can be a little bit of an aha moment for organizations to have, particularly for senior leaders.
Well, great. Thank you, guys. That concludes our Q&A session for today, and concludes our event here at the first slot of Vinnova Silicon Valley at Sweden Innovation Days. So thank you very much, Leah Zaidi from Institute for the Future. Thank you very much, Felicia Gustafsson. this has been a treat to have, and the recording of this webinar will be up at let's see, Sweden in SiliconValley.se, and I'll rewatch this for sure, because it was packed with great and interesting information. And don't forget to check out Vinnova.se if you're interested in the speculative design open call that opens up on Monday. Don't forget to check out Institute for the Future, their website. You should really subscribe to their newsletter. Also, you should, if you're into learning more about strategic foresight, Institute for the Future has also different types of educations available, both directly and tailor-made from IFTF, and also on Coursera, Futures Thinking specialization, which is really great as well. So thank you very much, guys. That's it, and take care. Bye.
Thank you, Institute for the Future and Vinnova team. Thank you, speakers and audience. The recording will be soon available at SwedenInSiliconValley.se, as Joakim mentioned. Follow us also on LinkedIn to hear about our future activities.